There we go. Thank you again for joining this evening. We're pleased tonight to be joined by Ira Idle, who is the curator and webmaster of Autistic Archive, a website dedicated to documenting the neurodiversity movement. And Ira, thank you for joining us this evening to share this information.
Oh, thank you for having me. So I'm going to go full screen here on my browser. Oh, sorry. Um, Gonna need to drag this out of the way. It might take me a second. I'm just trying to get to the present button. There we go. All right. So good evening, everyone. So like you said, my name's Ira Idle. My pronouns are he, they. I'm a white guy wearing glasses. I've got facial hair, and I'm wearing a necklace and a purple shirt. I'm sorry. That says non-compliance is a social skill, realsocialskills.org. I'm in a white room with a poster in the back for Pokemon Symphonic Evolution. So anyway, so I've been working on Autistic Archive for about 2.5 years at this point. I started working on it at the end of my senior year of college. It was a good way to distress from a lot of things. It was originally a series of Google Drive folders that I then decided to adapt into a website. And it's getting plenty of attention since then. I even won an award from Autistic Self Advocacy Network, which is their logos pictured here. The Mel Bags Down in the Valley Award for the award goes to people who do a good job of preserving Mel Bags' legacy. So I was very happy to receive that award. I also participated in ASAN's Autism Campus Inclusion Program when I was in college in the summer of 2020. I graduated from Kennesaw State University with a bachelor's degree, bachelor's of the arts in theater and performance studies. And I've also done some presentations at fan conventions about neurodiversity and just about other things. Right now, I work part-time at my local aquarium as an exhibit interpreter. So what that means is not interpreter in the ASL sense, but in the sense that I tell people about the animals and the habitats they're from and what their lives are like and give them conservation tips and the like. So that's what I do 4 days a week. And when I'm not doing that, I'm helping preserve neurodiversity movement history and writing about it. And I'm hoping to do some freelance journalism. That's something I'm looking into doing. And I'm also looking into eventually going back to school, probably for something history related. That's what I'm looking at the moment. Um, but for now, this is I am here to present to you. So I'm going to give you a somewhat comprehensive history of the neurodiversity movement, starting in the early 90s, going all the way to today. So that's spanning about 30 years we're looking at. Um, by the way, there is a lot of content, a lot of ground I am going to be covering tonight. And I also tend to talk pretty fast. So if at any point I am going too quickly, just let me know and I can go back to something. But I do ask that you hold your questions for the end. I do have a Q&A session. I timed for there to be enough room for that. So without further ado, I think I'm going to get started here. So as I've accidentally clicked a few times to the slide. So what is neurodiversity? Some of you may already be fairly familiar with the subject, but neurodiversity is shorthand for neurological diversity. It is a concept that emerged in the 1990s. It was used informally on email lists before it became more popularized as neurodiversity around the late 90s, early 2000s. It's an idea, and it's honestly not even that original of an idea, since it is very similar to just disability rights movement in general, and it's really an idea that not everybody has the same kind of brain, and that is okay. And in the words of the late Harvey Bloom, just as biodiversity is crucial for the existence of our planet, paraphrasing here, mind you, neurodiversity is crucial for human existence. It's a movement that emphasizes that society should include and respect people with brain-based disabilities. It was an outgrowth of the greater disability rights movement, which largely focused on physical disabilities, especially the independent living movement. And as you'll see, I think in the next slide, you'll see kind of how neurodiversity fits in within the greater disability rights movement. So I took some of this template from a presentation that ASAN gives people, especially in their ACI program. I'm sorry if you hear if you hear a vacuum, by the way. It includes all of these sub movements, including independent living, the deaf and blind communities, the self advocacy movement, as well as the Mad Pride and mental health consumer and psych survivor movement. The neurodiversity movement of these is definitely the newest of them. And it's interesting to see a movement that was started after the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and how that might compare and contrast with those other movements because of it. A lot of people who are part of the neurodiversity movement and who are part of its founding are what's part of what's called the ADA generation. I believe that term was coined by Rebecca Coakley, which describes people who came of age after the passage of the ADA with more actual disability services in the community in place and an actual law that says that society needs to have some baseline accommodations for people with disabilities. That's also not even to mention Section 504 in IDEA. So a lot of what I'm talking about in my presentation is going to be heavily US based, since that's what I know the most about. But the neurodiversity movement is certainly an international movement as well. So by the way, you might have heard neurodiverse and neurodivergent used in different contexts. So I kind of wanted to parse that out at the beginning here. And by the way, a lot of what I'm using here can be found bits and pieces of in my video lessons that I've done for Autistic Archive. So neurodiverse is a very niche term, and it's mostly misused. It really is meant to describe a group of people, not all of whom have the same neurology, but a lot of times, especially certain workplaces, they will use the term neurodiverse to describe a group of exclusively of neurodivergent people. And granted, most people are multiply neurodivergent, who are neurodivergent. It's still it's still just a very niche term, and in fact, the reason why neurodivergent was coined by Kassiana Sasamasu, but there were some other people who also kind of came up with the word too around the same time, because it just made a lot more sense than neurodiverse, since neurodivergent can be applied to both groups and individuals. And when all else fails, you could also just say disabled people or people with disabilities. So the main conflicts of the neurodiversity movement are who are the real experts? Is it autistic people, or just the neurodivergent people, or the people with the lived experience of disability, or is it the parents and the professionals? And granted, those groups are by no means mutually exclusive, but a lot of times the party lines do kind of fall between those two. So what causes autism? And that's been a huge subject of debate for, I'd say, the past century, since really the word autism was first published about in the 1910s. But I think the neurodiversity movement has started to actually give an accurate frame of what actually causes autism and what autism actually is like from the inside. Because the neurodiversity movement comes after about 70 to 80 years of prior research being done by an out group of people who mostly were not autistic, at least were not openly autistic or otherwise neurodivergent, coming up with all these theories about what autism is and what it's like and such, without really any meaningful input from the people that they were actually studying. So at a certain point, I think those people were inevitably going to push back against a lot of things and create their own spaces and build their own power. Of course, there's been a huge debate as to whether autism should be cured or not. The neurodiversity movement's position is largely that it should not be. What services are appropriate, and really this is key to any disability sub movement. A lot of these, I think, you could apply to other disability sub movements, and just you interchange a few words here and there. Who gets to be part of the community? Who counts as autistic or neurodivergent, and who doesn't? And what's a valid form of diagnosis and what isn't, that kind of stuff. And as I already kind of alluded to, the self advocates versus parents and professionals, which again are not mutually exclusive, but a lot of times the division does tend to go along those lines, at least kind of stereotypically, I guess you could say. So anyway, so we're starting out with the 1990s, and really this also is kind of the late 80s too, but things really started getting rolling in the 1990s. So Autism Network International was started in 1992 by Jim Sinclair, Zinnia Grant, and Donna Williams. It was originally a pen pal list. So Jim, Zinnia, and Donna met through a pen pal list that was maintained by parents, and then they met each other in person at a conference, and they remarked how it felt like they were finally meeting people from their home planet after being stranded on a foreign planet their whole lives. So they decided they wanted to start their own organization, and they also started a newsletter called Our Voice, and eventually they became a more formal organization, and were really minted in 1992. And at first, it wasn't really considered a community as so much as it was considered a network, which hence the name Autism Network International. And Donna Williams, while Zinnia and Jim were based here in the U.S., Donna was based in Australia. So that's kind of where the international comes from, but there are also people from other parts of the globe who were involved with ANI. They were in operation until 2013, when the last, you'll see me talk more about this, when the last treat happened. But there are other people who've kind of carried on that work over time, and they really helped lay the groundwork for a lot of things. I think even though there were some limitations to ANI as an organization, there's a lot of good stuff that they did, and really like laid the foundation for that. That certainly deserves some appraisal. Um, so the first autism, so I like saying the history of the neurodiversity movement is also the history of the internet, since the two have evolved alongside each other, and also autistic people use have all ever pretty much since it first started. The internet's been a very important place for a lot of autistic people, whether it's just because of how convenient it is, how it lowers the pressure of that in-person communication has, and such. But the neurodiversity movement really started to mobilize on the internet. And back in the early days, it was exclusively email. Email lists and servers were a lot rare, a lot more expensive to maintain, and they were mostly maintained by colleges and universities, since those were the places that kind of needed that form of communication the most. So a lot of people would rely on university lists to connect with other people via the internet. They would use what was called dial-up, where they would, I think they would connect to their landline phone. And a lot of this stuff is like just very, a lot of this isn't stuff really done nowadays. We have high-speed internet nowadays, right? Landline phones are not really used as much anymore in households. But St. John's University in, I believe, St. Louis, Missouri, they had the autism list, and this was the only autism email list on the internet at the time. So there were people who learned about it, I think, through conferences and such, that were run by neurotypicals that were about autism. And there ended up being a lot of disagreements between AC, so that's autistics and cousins. You'll learn a little more about that later, and the neurotypical users. And it really came to a head in what was called the Snore Wars, where Jim had a friendly conversation with a friend that Z stayed with. Jim used Z's and Zer pronouns, by the way. that Z stayed with overnight, had a playful conversation about snoring. And then there was a parent who complained that they were wasting bandwidth. And then it kind of got into this whole argument that, well, you guys can talk anytime you want, but when us autistics and cousins start talking to each other, we're wasting bandwidth. We can only speak when we're spoken to instead of really being able to have control over our conversations on here. So a lot of that disagreement led to the development of an email list. I forget what university it was initially on, but when Jim Sinclair moved, Jim Sinclair was faculty at one university, and then I think it was UKBM. I forget what the acronym stands for there. But Z moved to Syracuse, New York, and became a counselor at Syracuse University. So the list server later moved to Syracuse, and then later Martijn Dekker, who was based in the Netherlands, now lives in the UK. He started his own list called Independent Living on the Autism Spectrum, which was a bulletin board system. Um, which I guess one thing I can compare that to from nowadays, like the first thing that comes to mind is Discord, or really just like your old internet forums where there were different topics and such that were separated, and people would go into each of the channels and talk about different things and such. So those were places where people would gather online, where they would grow community, and would start bouncing a lot of ideas off of each other. So in 1993, so the Don't Mourn for Us was published in the first volume of Our Voice in 1992, but it wasn't until 1993 that it was really, my bad, that it was delivered orally at the Autism Society of Ontario's conference in Toronto. So that's in Canada. It was initially proposed to be delivered at Autism Society of America's conference. But not only did they reject it, but their president at the time deliberately went out of the way to instruct the committee not to accept it, which I think is very underhanded. I don't know why that is. The listed reason, at least from what I read in the book Neurotrides, is that because Temple Grandin was giving a similar talk, but that still feels nasty to just like deliberately exclude a speech from it. I think the real reason is they were a bit too scared about it. Probably sounded a bit too radical to them or something. So it was delivered orally in Toronto instead, and this drew a lot more attention towards ANI, towards their email list and such. Sorry. And ANI kind of had a booth at conferences that ACs would gravitate towards as kind of their made up spot, I guess. And one of the people there who was, on the St. John's list and such, and Zinnia wasn't really using email, and she met this guy who was not autistic but had hydrocephalus, which is also a brain-based disability, and he had a lot of very similar experiences. And Zinnia warmly proclaimed him as a cousin. So that's why that you see ACs and autistic cousins. It's unfortunately not really used in autistic spaces nowadays, but I think it's a very great inclusive term that also trivializes the debate over self-diagnosis. But that really became a sticking point, the idea of cousins. And Jim remarked that after this conference, after there started to be more growth in ANI, that ANI started to feel more like a community than a network by this point. So after ANI started to gain some more traction, there was an organization called, bear with me now on this name, More Abled Autistic People, which wasn't autistic led, but they did have a conference in 95 that they wanted to have people from ANI help plan that would be autistic led and such. And there ended up being a lot of really big disagreements, and the director of MOP was very hostile towards people, really didn't honor their contributions, tried to bar people considered low functioning from attending, which the people in ANI did not take kindly to. So this caused them to decide that it was time to host their own autistic-led conference. So they took a few things from that conference, from what they planned in the MOP conference, such as the color communication badges, which are used at a lot of autism and disability conferences nowadays, which are basically like traffic lights. They indicate your willingness to engage with other people. So the green is you can approach me if you'd like and start conversation. Yellow is only approach me if you know me, and red is don't approach me at all. Um, I think originally it was just yellow and red, and then green was added later. So Odd Treat was first held in 1996 in Canandaigua, New York, at a 4-H center, and it was held in this at this center for 4 years until they started. Then they moved the conference to college campuses, as they found that those were more accessible all around for their guests. But it was majority autistics and cousins, which is a vast, stark contrast from the other conferences that where the ACs were in the minority. Now they are in the majority at these conferences. So any neurotypicals who attended, it would be a very different. It would create a very different culture, one that would take a lot of decompression after the conference ended, kind of just settling back into normal life, which I think you could say about a lot of different events like this. But I don't think that kind of same kind of decompression was there with the neurotypical led conferences. So Autry was held from 1996 to 2013, almost annually. They skipped a few years. But it was last held in 2013. I don't really want to get into it now. There was a lot of arguments and back and forth and such that caused Jim to just kind of retire. And ANI wasn't that big of an organization. They never gained a nonprofit status. I think a lot of what they did was Autry. And there were other organizations that had come around it by then that had also gained traction, that were doing a lot of stuff that they were doing, operating upon similar principles. And they just, I think just all around it was, I think that ANI, ANI was already kind of on its last legs. It just took one last straw. Um, but it sounds like it was really great and very meaningful when it did happen. And now there are similar retreats held. The UK holds Autscape every year, and has been for almost 20 years. And then there's also Autspace, kind of weird naming convention, how the P and the C are like literally the same place, right? But that has been held a couple times here stateside. It hasn't been held since 2019 because of the pandemic. I hope they do hold another one someday. Um, so from the things like from Autry, and really with the what was I think called the World Wide Web bubble or something like that, when websites started to become a core tenet of the internet, you got this website called autistics.org, which was connected, I believe, to the server of ANI, since as I was talking about earlier, it was a lot rarer and more expensive to have your own server at the time. So a lot of times, one bigger server would host a server for a lot of smaller websites. And this was the case for autistics.org. They're the first known website to be by and for autistic people that was done for a political purpose. It was started by Laura Tasonchik, also known as Muskie Online, who already had experience with a lot of progressive movements in the 1960s, such as a feminist, LGBT, racial justice, even some like legitimate leftist movements. And I think she took a lot of what she knew from a lot of the work from those movements and paid it forward with the neurodiversity movement. And then later on, you would see someone I'm going to definitely talk more about, Mel Baggs, also come on as one of the people in charge of the site. So it subverted a lot of tropes used by major autism organizations. They briefly had the slogan, "The Real Voice of Autism," which was actually a parody of Autism Society of America's logo, which was at the time the voice of autism. They had this whole page on their website called the Institute for Study on the Neurologically Typical, which was a parody site meant to be a reverse of the usual autism study institutes, where it was full of autistic people studying neurotypicals in the same meticulous pathologizing fashion. Um, and they also had an internet relay chat, which is basically instant messaging called Ot Friends, that was started after a scuffle. And in fact, the whole site was really started after the scuffle that happened on the IRC Asperger's. Even the owner of that chat apparently kind of tried to sabotage the Ot Friends list, which is weird. But you can read more about that in the online book, open access book, Autistic Community and the Neurodiversity Movement by Stephen Cap. Here are a few of the buttons that they would sell on the site. Their Autism Liberation Front wasn't an actual website. It was kind of just like a banner they used. It was inspired by the Gay Liberation Front that they use on autistics.org. It was just kind of part of their branding, more or less. And they had this is really where you start to see opposition to what was at the time, what at that time had really come to be the commonly recognized autism symbol, and still is to a large extent, which is the puzzle piece, and even the puzzle ribbon that Autism Society of America kind of came up with. So there was some pushback against that as a symbol because of what it represented, that autism was a puzzling condition, which I think a lot of them felt like they couldn't be separated from their autism. So it was as if they were being portrayed as if they were puzzling themselves. So it was deliberately drawn to be like a mirror stick figure. It says, "I am not a puzzle, I am a person." And if you'll notice, there's the puzzle ribbon here on the right side here that says, "Here we're silent," and then "Parents don't speak for me." So really, like, having disagreements with parent groups was baked into the neurodiversity movement's DNA from the beginning. So I think that's a lot of where you see the so-called autism wars come from. Like, a lot of it just comes from stuff that happened in the 90s. But it's also not unique to the neurodiversity movement either. So it's also something worth keeping in mind. There were several organizations that already had done more organizing, that had more power and capital than what was present in the neurodiversity movement at this point. So we're now talking about the late 90s, early 2000s. So you had organizations like Cure Autism Now, the National Alliance of Autism Research, both of which later got absorbed by Autism Speaks. They both merged with them. And then there was the Autism Research Institute, which had the Defeat Autism Now protocol. So that was led by Bernard Rimland, one of the co-founders of ASA, along with Lovas. To be clear, Lovas was one of the co-founders of ASA. I don't think he had much to do with the Research Institute. But Rimland had a lot of these very dubious pseudoscientific, I think even by 1970, 80, 90 standards, were very dubious scientific ideas about autism supposedly being caused by a leaky gut. So he came up with this whole protocol where you would try to like flush the autism out. And there were a lot of doctors who really kind of jumped onto this initiative, the Dan protocol as it was known. And then eventually it turned out it didn't work. So the protocol is really not a thing anymore. But yeah, you had all this stuff. So the neurodiversity movement really never should have been largely about autism, I don't think. But the thing is, it became a very easy thing to organize around because autism was becoming such a hot button issue in the 90s and 2000s. It was like the hot new thing, kind of like, in a way, like COVID is now, or at least was a few years ago. And, HIV and AIDS were in the 1980s. I'm not saying autism is a disease. I'm just kind of giving some perspective here. It became just kind of that hot new thing that a lot of people were talking about and were theorizing about. And there started to become a really big moral panic surrounding it, masquerading as autism awareness, when really a lot of that was not truly awareness, but more hype than anything. So it just became an easy thing to organize around. So the 2000s brought some more of the early internet. A lot of people used GeoCities, which was run by Yahoo. People also had email lists on Yahoo groups. that they would sign up for and participate in. Um, there was this is just one such example, but this is linked to on autistics.org. The APANA, Autistic People Against Neuroleptic Abuse, which was Europe based. They raised awareness of the harms of overprescribing psychotropic medication to autistic people. And we also had this game called, it's still around, but Second Life, which is a lot like The Sims. It's this virtual reality, except without the goggles, simulator game. Um, and autistics.org kind of had their own little site on there for Autistic Liberation Front. There were other disability subcommunities that would also kind of meet up there. It was a pretty cool place for people to just kind of meet in virtual space. That replicated some of what real life had without actually being in meat space. Um, I guess it's also pretty similar to like the metaverse in a way, except it's a lot cooler. but um, but anyway, so 2004, so something a huge sticking point of the neurodiversity movement. One service that there's really been a lot of objection to is applied behavior analysis, also known as ABA. And you had this researcher, this Canada-based researcher named Michelle Dawson, who herself was autistic, who wrote this paper called Misbehavior of Behaviorists, and it was a huge deal. It really broke down a lot of the ways in which behaviorists often acted unethically, a lot of the just very questionable claims and such behaviorists would make, including Lovas, but not limited to. Also, I think it was also a pretty scathing criticism of some of Skinner's stuff as well. Um, and there were people online. So this guy named Lenny Schaefer, who ran the Schaefer Report, a quarterly kind of like online magazine. Him and a bunch of allies, including ABA therapists, swarmed her neurodiversity advocates, making some very big accusations like that they were faking, or that, oh, they had Asperger's, non-autism, so they don't know what autism's really like, this, that, and the other. And it was, yeah, they really dogpiled on Michelle and on Dawson and other people. So they fired back with their own series of essays that can also be found on autistics.org. And then later that year, there was a Supreme Court decision in Canada called Auton v. British Columbia, which Michelle acted as an intervener in. So I think that's kind of like, I forget the exact term here, but for the Supreme Court of the United States, that would be something like, I think, an amicus briefing, um, where she kind of gave her opinion about it. And the court decided that a mother who couldn't get funding for her kids' ABA, that didn't violate the federal law. So that meant that funding for ABA was not secured at the federal level in Canada, but rather by provincial level, so by state level in U.S. speak. Which is interesting considering how widely covered ABA is here, and there's definitely been push for more ABA coverage in Canada as well. But it's just interesting that this particular decision happened. But I think this was one of the first really concerted efforts towards speaking out against ABA and all the harm, that all the baggage that really came from it. And now it's really like I think one of the main things the neurodiversity movement is against. It's kind of similar to, I guess, oralism in the deaf community. So it's just a kind of practice that seems to value passing as normal more than just existing authentically as yourself. And really, I could give a whole presentation on ABA. I made a video about it that's about 40 minutes long. So I think I'll just leave it at this. But I just found this particular incident very interesting. So also around 2004, so this is the first recorded use of the rainbow infinity symbol, which has just kind of become the symbol for the neurodiversity movement. It's not my personal favorite compared to other symbols, but I am okay with it. It was first used in Aspies for Freedom, which was this website started by this British-based couple, Amy and Gwen Nelson, and they broke off from this other site called Aspergia, which had all these really wild out there ideas about that, like that people with Asperger's were like these Aspergian mutants descended from this fictional Atlantis-like place. Uh, and so that website didn't last long, so they kind of made their own, and it had a lot of people who had acted in a very militant way, I would say. Um, they started Autistic Pride Day, which obviously takes some pointers from the LGBT movement, which was first observed in June on June 18th, 2005. So it's observed every year on June 18th. So a few key things in autistic spaces was started by autistic Aspies for Freedom, but they also were very militant and also very exclusionary towards people they didn't consider Aspies, which was a small example of what of a greater concept known as Aspie supremacy, uh, which is really more about just any kind of autistic person trying to like act like they are superior either to other autistic people or to everyone else. And it's been a huge problem in our spaces pretty much since the movement began. But I would say Aspies for Freedom and Aspergia is where a lot of that really started. And the people who organized in the early days of like ANI and such didn't really like hold to these values. I mean, there was some what they called neurotypical NT bashing in those days, but it wasn't quite on the level that this stuff was. Um, and then in 2005, a lot of the moral panic and such around autism really came to a head when this wealthy couple who had connections with NBC started their own organization known as Autism Speaks, and this is their original logo. Their current logo looks a little different, but it was started in February 2005 by Suzanne and Bob Wright. Their grandkid, I believe his name's Christian, was diagnosed with autism, and they decided to just really create this whole like I guess kind of media campaign surrounding it and surrounding autism because they knew people in high places, and it's always been sponsored by corporations and had a lot of corporate representatives on their board of directors. So they were this very big, hard to ignore, if not impossible to ignore, organization that was starting to just kind of pop up everywhere. And even though the stuff that they were saying wasn't really anything new, it was very similar to what Cure Autism Now was already doing. It was on a much bigger scale than before. So more people were starting to learn what autism was, but they were learning about it in a very stigmatizing way that portrayed autism as this very scary condition, this disease, this something that steals children and ruins marriages. And they had this early on. They had this short film that premiered at Sundance Film Festival, which is a pretty big film festival, um, called Autism Every Day, where their vice president at the time, Allison Singer, talked about wanting to drive her daughter Jody off of a bridge while she was in the room with her. And she said the only reason she didn't do it was because of her neurotypical daughter. Um, and that was the worst example of all of the other really like awful things in it. They purposefully got the kids and parents to be malnourished for the film, so it was already really dishonest to begin with. Now, over the years, there have been people in autistic led spaces who have tried, I guess, making a peace treaty, coming to some kind of truce with Autism Speaks, but none of it's really um, ended in any actual meaningful change. They have changed a lot of their aesthetics and such to seem less fear mongery, but they still support a lot of very harmful services. And really, all of the changes that have come to them over the years have been purely aesthetic. So they were very relevant for a long time, but they're starting to become less relevant, thankfully. But at the same time, they are still a really big organization. Um, they've just kind of rebranded, and a lot of their former executives are now working with other autism organizations that I would argue are more harmful. And you'll see me talk about that towards the end of the presentation. So it was the subject of much protest from the autistic self advocacy community pretty much right away. It was it was not taken too kindly to. And especially, I think Autism Every Day is really what cemented them as this organization people were not going to like from the neurodiversity movement. So it led to a lot of in-person protests, such as the ones that you see here. As you can see, the People Not Puzzles thing was adopted for these protests, as well as Nothing About Us Without Us, which is a slogan used in the wider disability rights movement. Also, a huge concern with autism space is that a lot of local autism organizations, like their popularity was like completely bulldozed by this large organization that was trying to advocate for a very standardized one size fits all level of autism services, which is why ABA is a lot more widespread in the U.S. now. Though I think there are other reasons that just kind of have to do with what the USA is like as a country. But that was they were a huge part of that. Um, and that's why I kind of see the keep autism money local, especially since a lot of the donation money that goes towards them doesn't really go back towards those local organizations or communities, and more so just kind of goes into the bigger stuff. Um, so in 2006, you saw that. So at first they were known as the Autistic Cell Social Action Committee, which was later changed to Self Advocacy Network to align themselves closer with the greater disability rights movement. So that was founded by Ari Naiman and Scott Robertson. Ari Naiman was their president for many years, and Scott Robertson, was involved and was on their board and such for a while. They adopted Nothing Without Us to also bring themselves closer to the disability rights movement. For 5 years, they were an all volunteer organization that organized over email and such. She recently resigned because of long COVID. But Julia Bascom described them as they used to be a group of people from across the United States, all on laptops. They now have a national organization that is a nonprofit that they run in Washington D.C., where they have people they employ and all, and they've done a lot of very great work. I would definitely say they are one of the flagship organizations of the neurodiversity movement, and I think represent a lot of the best work that has come out of it. And I'm not just to be fair, just to be clear, I'm not saying that just because I have good personal relationships with them. I already thought that about them before I even really knew them personally. So this is the original logo, and now this is their current logo, which I really love the wheel of interlocking shapes here. I think it's very satisfying, and I do much prefer it to the Rainbow Infinity symbol, but that's just me personally. Um, the thing that really put ASIN on the map was the Ransom Notes campaign, started by the New York University's Child Study Center, where they posted these ransom notes as ads for autism and ADHD and Asperger's, that talk about how they're impersonating those disabilities, saying that they have their kids and are holding them for ransom and such. And the people involved with ASAN, including Ari, found this to be very demeaning. So they started a campaign to try and get these ads pulled. Um, so they got some other organizations involved, including ADAPT, which is a civil disobedience direct action type organization that's just broader disability rights. And they had a petition and such. At first, they weren't going to pull the ads because they thought the protests meant the ads were working. But then, after more pressure, they eventually pulled the ads, and the campaign actually did end on my 10th birthday, December 19th, 2007. So that I think is interesting. So this is considered by someone wrote in a disability studies article that this is when the neurodiversity movement came of age, and I think in a lot of ways it was. It was what really cemented the neurodiversity movement as a serious part of the disability rights movement. Now, I don't think it's quite as big as, say, the Capitol crawl in the 90s or Deaf President Now, which happened at Gallaudet University. I don't think we've quite had a watershed moment like that yet, but this is probably about as close as we've gotten to it. And there were a lot of blogs. Blogging became a really big thing in the late 2000s on the internet, and there was this whole interconnected blogging hub, kind of blogosphere known as the Autism Hub. So that was they had their they when Bernard Rimland passed away, they had a wall against autism that was like a big tribute to him. So people on the Autism Hub got together and created the wall against hate. So it has all these positive pro neurodiversity messages on here as a way of counteracting that. I just think it's really cool. It's a really cool artifact of the 2000s autistic internet. So I think at this point, okay, no, we're not quite there yet. So Autism Society of America had this online thing called Getting the Word Out, which had a lot of very stigmatizing stuff, a lot of the kind of stuff you would see in a typical Autism Speaks PSA. And Mel Baggs fired back with her own HIR. Mel's pronouns were see and hear, something as in seeing and hearing. So Mel had her own thing called Getting the Truth Out, which was a several part. You would click through different pages. It was kind of like a web quest, where Mel would talk about all of these reasons why people like Mel are stigmatized, and Mel like kind of mirrored some of the images that they use in the ASA uh, campaign. So I think this was a really neat thing Mel did, and it's just one example of all of the really great monumental work Mel did for this movement. I really just kind of wanted to take this specific slide to kind of pay tribute to Mel Baggs, because our movement would not at all be where it is today without the labor of Mel Baggs. Mel was, I feel like Mel saw things a lot more saw things straighter, or a lot. I guess I don't know if that's the right way to put it. Mel saw things a lot more holistically than I think even most people do now. And I think a lot of it has to do with Mel's involvement in other disability sub-movements as well, but also facing some of the harshest discrimination as someone who was mostly non-speaking and a survivor of institutionalization, and someone who ultimately passed away from medical neglect, who should still be alive, died at 39, almost 4 years ago. And yeah, Mel was truly amazing. I think we were very lucky. I never got to meet Mel myself, but I think this movement was very lucky to have Mel. And I am thankful every day that Mel was here when she was, and I'm also thankful to know people who knew Mel when she was alive, as that has also been very helpful. So now we're getting into the 2010s and 2020s. We're only in 2024, so it made more sense to just kind of group that with the 2010s. I'm mostly talking about the 2010s here anyway. So in late 2010, there was this kind of holiday observed called Autistic Speaking Day, which was first observed in 2010 after there was this organization based in Australia called the AEIOU Foundation, which had all of these, they proposed having this communication shut down. So basically a day of silence where you wouldn't go online. And this was, to mimic the silence that autistic people suffered from. But it was, a lot of people took issue with this, especially since the internet is very much a boon for a lot of autistic people, as I've established. So Karina Becker and Kat Bjornstad kind of came up with their own thing, where people would submit blog posts or write blog posts on their own sites and such, where they would talk about anything related to autism that they felt to be relevant to them. So that became Autistic Speaking Day, which, yes, is obviously a riff on Autism Speaks. So it was observed every year in November until actually just this year, the last one happened. I don't know why Karina decided she's not doing it anymore, but it was still a really nice thing in its prime, and really just kind of is the epitome of nothing about us without us, because that whole campaign wasn't really made with their input, but they gave their input anyway. More organizations started cropping up that were kind of within ASAN's network, such as the Autistic Women's Network, which now is the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network, which is a smaller scale organization that still does some really great work, has put out some great publications, and was also in its early days was a good place for autistic women and people of other marginalized genders to kind of meet and chat and such. And then there's also the Thinking Person's Guide to Autism, which is a place where a lot of great articles and such about autism, mostly from autistic people, have been published. That's actually jointly run by autistic people and parents, showing that we can in fact work together. And that's run by Shannon Roses, who actually she once was like in the very much had that cure mindset with her son Leo. But then she met people from the neurodiversity movement and very much, in the best way possible, turned coat, and is, now very much on our side. So you also started to see more autistic people on governmental advisory boards, at least within the United States. Ari Naaman was he was really young when this happened too. He was appointed to the National Council on Disability by the Obama administration. He was appointed, I believe, at the age of 22, 21 or 22. Ari really made a big impression early on, and I think it's pretty clear that he was really good at what he did. He was an excellent networker, and he also just was really good at planning things. So it also was like a big deal that someone involved in this movement was now on a governmental advisory board. And then he later was also on the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee, also known as IAC, which helps advise the federal government on where to spend money on autism research. That was created by the Combating Autism Act in 2006, now known as the Autism Cares Act. And more autistic people have started to appear on the committee too, even though they aren't always necessarily wanted by some of the other members or the people who give public comments. It certainly has become a hotbed for debate on things, for the so-called autism wars, I guess, since that is where you see a lot of it. Since they do kind of welcome all sides of the debate. But I think autistic people being involved with IAC is definitely a good thing. And I think it could potentially lead to some a shift in funding priorities away from the causation and cure research and more towards quality of life research. So next up, so the 2010s was where you started to see hashtags appear a lot, especially on sites like Twitter, which I think is really where they got their start. So you had all these campaigns to free people from prison or unexpel people such as Caleb. I got Justice for Caleb. That was from a friend on Facebook. That was their profile pic. And then Free Nellie. Thankfully, Nellie was freed from jail a few years ago, but that was Nellie Latson, who was wrongfully imprisoned. And I forget what that tweet was specifically about. I think it was something related to the murder of Alex Spordicolis. I don't know if I pronounced that right. And really, that kind of leads me into my next thing here. So the disability community has long had traditions where they honor, and this is included. This includes the Autistic Liberation Front on Second Life. They had a memorial for disabled people who were murdered by their caregivers. Filicide is a huge problem within our community. And a lot of times in the news media, when it's brought up, the perpetrators are given sympathy, while there really isn't any sympathy given to the actual victims of these murders. So Zoe Gross noticed this after the murder of George Hodgins in 2012 and decided to organize her own event called Disability Day of Mourning, which is organized which is observed in collaboration with ASAN across country and even in some other countries as well, every year on March 1st. I do think they could expand their scope a little bit, at least a little bit, to include disabled people who are victims of hate crimes and police brutality. But I still think it's very great that they do this. And it really comes to show just like I think like how much good work has come from ASAN, at least in my personal opinion. So Next up, this is also one of the biggest. This is one of the biggest campaigns of the neurodiversity movement. The Judge Rotenberg Center, which is currently open in Canton, Massachusetts, was initially the Behavior Research Institute. And it originally was in Rhode Island, then moved to Massachusetts. They also had a campus in California called Tobin World that got shut down, thankfully. But they are infamous for using these torturous electric shock devices. And they have been for about 40 to 50 years at this point. And there have been a lot of people trying to get them to stop doing that and to stop using the other forms of physical punishment that they do on their disabled residents. And there are legal loopholes that have led to them staying open and keeping their shock devices. But what really, I guess, was like where things really hit the fan in the early 2010s was when a video of a man named Andre McCollins was released, and it showed him being strapped to a table and shocked multiple times. And this was like on national news and such. And the hashtag Stop the Shock came from this. I think it came from Lydia Brown specifically, either Lydia Brown or their partner Shane Newmeyer, and they've been really leading the guard on a lot of efforts towards curbing attendance and trying to get the FDA to ban the shocks. Congress just gave them authority. Well, not just like a year ago, just gave them the power to do so. So now they need to act on that. So it's been a huge, very long and complicated fight. And it's even led to some people protesting in person at what was called Occupy the JRC. So it's still a huge deal and still something ongoing. But I do think that the people doing this work will eventually see the fruit of their labor. I don't think a place as heinous as the JRC can stay open forever. I really don't. So the early 2010s was also where you saw the rollout of the DSM-V. So this is where you get diagnosed with things like autism, and with it came a really significant change that rolled autism, Asperger syndrome, and PDD-NOS into a single diagnosis. There were representatives from ASAN, and namely Ari Naiman and Stephen Kapp, who were part of the APA's work group, who helped kind of frame the new diagnosis for autism. So the APA already wanted to roll the diagnoses into one category because it ultimately didn't really make sense to have them as separate diagnoses, and it led to a huge disparity in services. Ari and Steven worked further to kind of they did end up still keeping levels for autism. They were very insistent on having that, but they did kind of help frame it away from. They were going to have level of stimming and special interests as part of the severity scale, which really didn't make sense, and there was really no scientific or clinical basis for that. And a lot of the advocacy that Ari and Stephen did was based in research literature and science. So they really kind of helped improve the autism diagnosis. Of course, there are still issues with it. And well, the DSM is not the end all be all, but it is a very important document. I mean, it does, determine what services you may or may not get, since to even get services, you do need to have an official diagnosis. And a lot of people were very opposed to the removal of Asperger's, even in autistic spaces, and still do because they think there is a significant enough difference between autism and Asperger's, when really the data shows there really isn't. It at least doesn't make sense to have them as two separate diagnoses. And while having the Asperger's diagnosis also led to Aspie supremacy, which kind of is its own thing and isn't the reason why Asperger's was removed. But it at least was kind of helpful in like kind of showing why that was an issue. So anyway, so you also started to see, this was in 2017. I wanted to highlight this because this was really a cross disability effort. So Senator Mitch McConnell proposed was the BCRA, which would make some very sweeping cuts to Medicaid. which a lot of people with disabilities rely on in order to get services where they can actually live in their community. So they organized so ASAN, ADAPT, I think National Council on Independent Living, all of these disability organizations and advocates from different disability communities kind of set a lot of their differences aside and protest. They actually like occupied McConnell's office to protest the cuts to Medicaid, and people like Anita Cameron pictured here were manhandled. They were carried out of the Capitol for this, but it was a concerted effort. There was like a whole system in place for people getting carried out and arrested and such. But it was successful. They were able to prevent the Medicaid cuts cut from happening, which is really great. There are still, I will say, like in the state of Georgia, there's a huge waiting list for waivers for Medicaid, home and community-based services for people with developmental disabilities. So it's still like definitely an issue, but this would have been like on a national level. And it's great that people were able to successfully push back against this. On the picture on the left, you see here, I think I got from Ari Naaman's Facebook page, Autistics Against BCRA. Please save our healthcare so we can stop making phone calls. And he's pictured here with Zoe Gross and Kelly Israel. So we're starting to see, like I was saying, a lot of people who were formerly involved with Autism Speaks have branched out into their own organizations. Allison branched out into Autism Science Foundation largely over concerns about Autism Speaks, questioning the vaccine autism link, which they now don't, but it was still weird that they were doing it with the veracity that they were. So Allison Singer started her own organization that still was very in favor of like curing autism of institutions and such, but was like pro vaccines, which I guess is something, but not much. Though I will say Allison Singer, I don't know if it's because people know of her from Autism Every Day in the neurodiversity movement, but she's really become a huge opponent to our movement, and she just kind of seems to relish in that role. I don't even know why she still has a career after saying such heinous things, but it is what it is. You also see organizations like the National Council on Severe Autism, which was started about 5 years ago, a very reactionary group and a lot of these groups kind of they advocate for old school institutions because they think that it gives people more choices. And that's right. That goes back to a similar organization called Voice of Reason, which used to be known as Voice of the R Word. And they actually opposed the Olmsted Supreme Court case, or at least parts of it. And there's also Council of Autism Service Providers, which has been very big on pushing for ABA. But these organizations and the Profound Autism Alliance, the newest of these, have been really gaining this new quote unquote label of profound autism has been gaining a lot of traction as of late, after it was proposed in the Lancet's report from 2021. And it's not something that has any actual clinical basis, and it's something that its very proponents don't seem to be entirely sure on what it actually means. They seem to just, it's something they seem to want to, it's kind of the moving the goalpost and the Texas sharpshooter logical fallacies, where they're saying that there are people that need to be cured or that need to be institutionalized that have a very specific kind of autism, that like even people who are non-speaking have intellectual disabilities that like are, that have made a lot of contributions to the movement, that they somehow don't count as part of that. And they don't seem to be able to consistently keep a running like definition of what profound autism is. So I'm hoping this is something that kind of fizzles out. But for now, there's been a lot of rhetoric and research and stuff done around this supposed profound autism that is just so different and so much more profound than all other forms of autism that it deserves its own category. But luckily, we are seeing people who are non-speaking or semi-speaking. We're starting to see them get more platforms and start more of their own organizations and such. Such as Communication First, which is, like I said, a public policy organization based in DC. They were started about 4 or so years ago, and the International Association for Spelling is Communication, which isn't entirely, not all these organizations are entirely run by people who use AAC, but they are at least jointly run by them. There's also the Zagwande Foundation based in Africa. I forget which specific nation. And then there's this Facebook group that is entirely led by people who use AAC called Ask Me I Am an AAC User. So you're starting to see, I mean, this kind of literature and stuff existed long before any of this did, but I think this is the stuff we kind of have now in the modern day that really kind of show that like that people who may not communicate in a conventional way still very much have a voice, have thoughts, and deserve to be respected. Uh, and you're also autistic people of color have also been largely underrepresented in our movement's history. But we're starting to see more autistic people start to get more platforms and start their own organizations based around autism and race, such as the Autistic People of Color Fund, started by Lydia Brown in 2018 with support from the American Association of People with Disabilities, which is also connected to AWN. They did have this book called All the Weight of Our Dreams, which was an anthology read entirely with authors who are autistic people of color. They pulled the publication a few years ago. I think they were talking about making a new edition. I haven't heard anything about that since then. But this is an organization that currently uh, is basically a lot of mutual aid and such. That is that's by and for autistic people of color, and it is meant to give like that kind of mutual aid to autistic people of color who really need it. And so I wanted to end my presentation, at least before we get to the question and answers, with listing all of these different books that you can get. Books have been a huge part of the neurodiversity movement since its beginning. So you have Loud Hands from ASAM, which I actually have 2 copies of since I got one for Christmas and then got one for free when I did ACI. You have Sincerely Your Autistic Child, A Day with No Words, which is a picture book. Disability Visibility by Alice Wong, who, by the way, is currently in the hospital. She had a ruptured, her feeding tube has been ruptured. I'll try and link the GoFundMe for a running GoFundMe she just has for her services in general. But there's also Neurotribes, which was a huge deal that really kind of helped bring neurodiversity more to the forefront. And you have Kid Lit, such as Get a Grip, Bibi Cohen by Sarah Kaplan. You're also starting to see, I could do a whole presentation on this too, on media representation of autistic people or just of neurodivergent people in general. You're starting to see some more like actual authentic representation too, such as from Pixar's Loop or the purple turtle Donnie in Rise of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And then there's Heartbreak High, which is on Netflix, and then Everything's Gonna Be Okay, which was canceled after 2 seasons, but was produced by an autistic person and had an autistic lead too. And then Owl House has its lead is confirmed. She is confirmed to have ADHD. So you're starting to see some better representation here, which I do think is important. Though I also don't really think it's necessarily the end all be all of neurodiversity or of disability rights. But it is good to start seeing more of that today. So that now brings us to the question and answer. I made sure to time this so that I had enough time to really do Q&A. So I'll now open the floor to you guys. I have not checked the chat at all, so I don't know if anyone's left anything in there. But yeah, that was basically my presentation. So now hold on, I'm trying to figure something out here. Okay, stop share. Okay, so now it's just me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ira. That was so informative. And, there's a few things that I was familiar with, but learned a lot of information. So thank you for sharing that. Before we wrap up for the evening, does anyone have any questions for Ira? You could either unmute or you could put them in the chat as well.
I mostly just want to say thank you. That was amazing. I really appreciated especially how you were so careful to credit specific activists and
Yeah.
to really get specific about who said and did what and who coined which terms.
Yeah.
I think that's a really great thing to do, and it can be hard to keep track of all those names
Yeah,
and
yeah.
who did what. So thank you. I'm just wondering if the slides will be available or the recording after this presentation.
I can certainly provide the slides.
Yes, there
I'll
should
do
have
that
been
right
a
now,
PDF
actually.
on the email that went out with the Zoom link, but just let me know
Oh,
if you
yeah,
want
that
it
okay, that's true.
resent,
Yeah.
and I can do that. But slides are definitely available.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah,
and
that is there.
I'm
Thank you.
trying to
Yep,
find where the text chat is so I can post some stuff in there.
sure.
Oh, there's chat. Okay. And I'm to everyone. So first off, I'm gonna post a link to Autistic Archive, which is where you can really find all my stuff. Um, including all of my videos that go more in depth into everything I talked about today. And let me get that link to Alice's fundraiser too. Um, I'm going to share two different fundraisers actually. So this one is for Alice. Oh, okay, it's going to take me a minute. Okay. I don't. By the way, I don't think they actually expect to raise $100 million. I think they just have it as an indefinite goal so that they can keep it going.
Mhm.
And then this is for my friend Noor, who is a staff member at ASAN, who right now needs help paying for his dog Kibby's cancer surgery. He's done a lot of very important work in our community and with ASAN. I've already donated myself, but if anybody is interested, I'm going to leave the link to that too here.
Right. Did anyone else have any questions for Ira?
I don't necessarily have a question, but
Yeah,
everybody knows me. I'm Philip Kinglow. I own Today's Autistic Moment, a podcast for autistic adults by an autistic adult.
yeah,
Back in 2022, I led one of my Autistic Voices roundtable discussions about the
yeah.
hashtag Stop the Shock movement.
Ah,
Because in March of 2020, the
yeah,
Food and Drug Administration had sought to ban the shock treatments, but a panel of federal judges in
yeah.
2021
Mm-hmm.
ruled that the ban interferes with the doctor's ability to, quote, practice medicine. So I had a conversation about that matter among many
Yeah,
others, but
yeah. It's a whole can of worms.
it really is, and one of the things that one of them remarked was is that they couldn't actually believe that we are even still talking about this in in
Yeah,
the
yeah.
decade of
It's
the
wild.
2020s. Yeah, but anyway, um but many of the authors that Ira mentioned I have interviewed on my podcast,
Oh,
including
cool.
Eric Garcia.
Yeah, he's great.
So oh, he's absolutely awesome. So um
Yeah.
I've actually sent you um a contact on LinkedIn, so just
Oh,
letting
that's
you know
awesome.
that.
Yeah, I'll definitely respond to that.
Okay.
You also, I was gonna post my socials too. So if you use Facebook, I'm just me on Facebook.
Yeah.
But I'll put my Instagram and Twitter on here too, since I
Okay.
also use those daily.
Let's see.
Uh,
Can you also link your podcast too so we can go check that out?
Yep, I can absolutely do that. Give me a moment.
Thanks.
I'm gonna link the website to the podcast, and then you can find what I was talking about as you uh click through the menu options. But here we go. Yeah. Eric was just on there this past Saturday
mhm.
talking about emergency preparedness planning for autistic adults.
Oh, that's
Very well
cool.
done show. Yes.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
very
I
good, of
like Eric a lot.
course.
Before we wrap up here this
Yeah.
evening, any other final questions or comments for Ira?
By the way, I've been playing with this whole time. this brass fidget spinner. Just thought y'all,
Very cool.
just thought
Oh,
everyone
dear.
see it.
Okay. Very, yeah. Good job, Ira. Very good. Very good. All right.
All right. Well, thank you again, everyone, for joining this evening. We will wrap up there, but thank you for joining. And until next time, take care.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.